Imagine you're at a backyard barbecue. You've got one guy at the grill, another guy watching the perimeter fence with binoculars, a third guy refusing to leave the pool, and a fourth guy in the bushes eating a crayon just to see what happens. Then, a cousin shows up in a high-tech suit looking for aliens, while a lifeguard stands by the cooler making sure no one trips over it. This scene looks like a mess of overlapping tasks and redundant roles, an expensive, disorganized group project. It's the same reaction many have to the United States Department of Defense. Understanding the military requires looking past the uniforms and focusing on functions of reality. Each of the 6 branches owns a specific physical domain. The Army owns the dirt, the Navy owns the water, the Air Force owns the sky, the Space Force owns the void, the Coast Guard owns the border, and the Marines own the doorway. This meticulously specialized ecosystem is designed from the ground up to divide and conquer every physical plane of the universe. The oldest and largest domain is the ground. The Army operates on a philosophy of land dominance. You cannot occupy a physical city with a fighter jet. To actually keep a piece of land, you need a human being with a rifle physically standing on it. But the vast majority of the Army doesn't carry a rifle. For every 1 infantryman on the ground, there are about 7 people behind him managing the logistics. The Army functions as a massive, self-sustaining, moving city with its own doctors, mechanics, and movers. This massive logistical train ensures that highly specific items, down to a standardized pouch of spaghetti with meat sauce, are delivered directly into the hands of the soldier occupying that dirt. Holding the dirt is entirely dependent on reaching it. Because 70% of the Earth is water, securing the oceans is a prerequisite for moving the troops and keeping the global economy functional. That is the role of the Navy. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier represents 4.5 acres of sovereign U.S. territory. Powered by a nuclear reactor and carrying its own airport at 35 miles per hour, it is a tool of mobile diplomacy that projects power across the global highways. Beneath those highways, the Navy operates a secondary, silent service. Ballistic missile submarines carry enough nuclear payload to end a civilization, operating 800 feet below the surface for months at a time. Their strategic value relies on remaining ghosts until they are needed. The Army holds the ground, but they are entirely dependent on the Navy to secure the global waters necessary to reach that dirt and the trade routes that fund the operation. During World War II, the sky emerged as a distinct threat vector that dictated the outcome of every battle on the ground. This realization prompted President Truman to authorize the Air Force as a separate branch in 1947. The Air Force's primary mandate is air superiority. For the initial breach of a conflict, the military uses a specialized expeditionary force. The Marines travel light and deploy rapidly from the water, serving as the first to hit the enemy. Operating with tighter budgets and a hyper-aggressive cultural mindset, the Marines act as the shock troops. Their function is to violently break down the front door so the larger army can move inside and hold the house. While the other branches train for potential conflicts, the Coast Guard is in an active war every single day. Every day, the Coast Guard jumps out of helicopters into 30-foot ocean waves to execute rescues and secure the nation's perimeter. Because they sit under the Department of Homeland Security during peacetime, they possess exclusive law enforcement powers on the water. While the Navy can track a drug smuggler, only the Coast Guard has the legal authority to move in and make the arrest. The Marines are specialized to cross oceans and kick down foreign doors. The Coast Guard is the only force trained and legally authorized to lock the door here at home. The Space Force manages the high-altitude infrastructure that makes modern society possible. Its guardians operate high-tech centers to defend the satellite network, managing orbital assets that underpin ATM transactions, weather forecasts, and drone strikes. This network is the military's neural system, routing GPS and secure communications globally so all branches can coordinate. If an enemy blinds these satellites, the machine suffers paralysis. Navy ships lose bearings, the Air Force loses targeting, and the Army cannot call for help. This invisible domain of the void is the single point of failure that holds the entire physical military together. Despite their different uniforms and intense rivalries, no branch fights alone. Modern conflict relies on joint operations. It works like a heist crew. You need the hacker in space,
the getaway driver on the water, the muscle on the ground, the climber on the wall, the lookout on the perimeter, and the eye in the sky.
The true strength of the U.S. military lies in its ability to align these 6 functions of reality into a single strike. In Part 2, we'll see exactly how the nation builds, funds, and fuels this massive machine. To understand how the U.S. military functions, you have to look at its most potent asset, the credit card. The annual defense budget currently sits between $800 and $900 billion. If you spent $1 million every day since year 0, you'd still be short of the military's yearly budget. Looking at the total budget, the secret stealth gold image disappears. The sliver for classified tech is barely visible compared to the primary costs. Those costs are largely biological. The military spends the vast majority of its resources on the daily survival of its personnel, salaries, housing allowances, healthcare, and massive procurement of groceries. The logistical floor of a global superpower is the immense financial weight of sustaining the lives of over 2 million people. Every year, thousands of teenagers enter a pipeline designed to strip away their civilian identities. Upon arrival, they lose their clothes, their hair, their phones, and the right to use the word I. Basic training is the psychological re-engineering of the recruit. The objective is to replace the individual ego with a team-centric operating system, where every action is a collective response. This volume serves a physiological purpose: stress inoculation. The drill sergeant acts as a controlled disaster, using high-decibel aggression to spike the recruit's heart rate. This repeated exposure teaches the brain to stay functional and obedient at 160 beats per minute. Over several weeks, the lizard brain is rewired to follow an order as an instinct rather than a choice. By the time they graduate, the military has its first true weapon, a soldier who defaults to action even when their body is screaming to freeze. While strategy occupies the headlines, the actual mechanics of victory are found in logistics. To maintain 10,000 soldiers in a combat zone, the military must move 30,000 meals a day, 50,000 gallons of fuel, and the entire medical and sanitation infrastructure of a small city. This capability allows the U.S. to build a functioning airfield with American fast food in the middle of a desert in under 72 hours. The National Guard and Reserves provide the scale for this system. These are dual-hatted warriors, history teachers and mechanics who spend most of the year answering to their state governors. They function as a national insurance policy. The government maintains a massive on-call army for emergencies without the daily expense of housing and feeding them as active-duty troops. A global superpower is defined by this underlying transit grid. It is the ability to project force and sustain it indefinitely on the other side of the planet. The hardware is built within a circular loop known as the military-industrial complex. The military identifies a need, Congress authorizes the capital, and private companies build the gear in the districts of the politicians who sign the checks. This feedback loop sustains a massive technological gap. A single F-35 flight helmet costs $400,000, but it allows the pilot to see through the floor of the jet via an array of external sensors. To make this technology useful, the U.S. maintains roughly 750 bases in 80 countries. These are forward operating hubs, placed specifically to ensure that the military is already there before a crisis begins. This physical footprint is directed by a digital vanguard, ISR. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance teams operate out of secure facilities that monitor the entire planet. Using orbital tracking and signal intercepts, these agencies map the enemy's movements and internal communications long before a physical shot is ever fired. Overwhelming firepower only works when you have the information dominance to find the target. ISR exists to eliminate the fog of war entirely. The machine is complete. It has the budget, the personnel, the global supply chains, the industrial base, and the orbital intelligence grid. This entire apparatus is currently assembled and idling, vibrating with the energy of $1 trillion investment. The only remaining question is what happens when this system is pushed into gear for a 21st century kinetic conflict. In Part 3, we are going deep. We are breaking down the specific tactical superpowers of each branch to see how this machine actually fights. Most people picture the United States Army as one massive, uniform block of soldiers marching in unison. But looking at the chaotic reality of warfare, what soldiers call the meat grinder, reveals that treating an army as a single, homogeneous entity is a dangerous misconception. On their own, individual components are incredibly vulnerable. A $6 million main battle tank rolling without infantry support is an expensive target for a lone enemy with a rocket launcher. And a group of infantrymen taking fire without heavy artillery to back them up is trapped, with no way to punch back. To solve this, the military relies on combined arms. Think of it as rock, paper, scissors, but the army plays all three hands simultaneously. The infantry, armor, and artillery cover each other's blind spots and lock together to form one unified, forward-moving fist. This synergy forms the baseline of modern U.S. military doctrine. The objective is never to enter an even contest, but to deploy a toolkit so asymmetric that the outcome is decided before the first shot is even fired. The M1A2 Abrams runs on a multi-fuel turbine engine that literally breathes jet fuel. It weighs 70 tons, so heavy that it cannot cross most civilian bridges without collapsing the structure underneath it. Its primary strength is stabilization. This machine can bounce over a ditch at 40 miles per hour while keeping the main barrel perfectly level and locked onto a moving enemy. Combined with its classified armor and a targeting system that outranges most opposing tanks, the Abrams is built to turn enemy armor into scrap metal before the opposing crew even registers a U.S. presence on their horizon. Out on the ocean, the Navy rarely sends a single ship into a conflict zone. Instead, they deploy a carrier strike group, an integrated formation that operates like a floating sovereign nation. The aircraft carrier acts as the heart. Surrounding it are cruisers and destroyers acting as a defensive shield, while attack submarines hide underneath as shadows, hunting enemy subs. To defend this fortress, the Navy uses the Aegis combat system. Aegis tracks hundreds of targets simultaneously, from the surface to the edge of space. When an enemy launches a swarm of missiles at the fleet, Aegis calculates their trajectories and tells the ship's vertical launchers exactly when to fire. Parking a carrier strike group off a coastline establishes a statement of reality, a mobile, high-density, no-fly zone that forces local military operations to a standstill. In the sky, the Air Force relies on low observability, commonly known as stealth. Aircraft like the F-22 Raptor use sharp angles to scatter radar waves, making them appear no larger than a metal bumblebee on an enemy screen. By the time an enemy radar operator realizes that tiny anomaly is actually an incoming fighter jet, the stealth aircraft has already launched a missile from 40 miles away and is turning back home. For global reach, they use the B-2 Spirit bomber. With its deep black paint and completely tailless design, it takes off from Missouri, drops a payload on the other side of the planet, and returns home without ever being detected. The Air Force secures its advantage by orchestrating surgical strikes where the target never even sees their attacker. To secure the narrow corridors between the deep ocean and dry land, the Marine Expeditionary Unit operates as a self-contained force, capable of seizing a shoreline through a simultaneous assault from the waves and the air. They cross the water using high-speed LCAC hovercrafts that glide onto the beach, while tilt-rotor Ospreys fly overhead, delivering troops behind enemy lines to cut off an escape. Operating in those same coastal waters, the Coast Guard fields a highly specialized unit called HITRON. Their primary mission involves tracking down drug smugglers in ultra-fast boats. HITRON snipers aim out the side of a vibrating helicopter, tracking a small outboard motor bouncing over waves at 60 miles per hour and disabling it with a single bullet. Whether it is a beach invasion or a surgical interdiction, these specialized forces ensure the U.S. maintains a disproportionate advantage in coastal transition zones. Beyond the atmosphere, the Space Force isn't flying starfighters. Their primary role is maintaining space situational awareness. They monitor a highly congested orbit. Thousands of pieces of space junk travel at 17,000 miles per hour, alongside intentional threats like anti-satellite missiles. If someone tries to shoot down an American satellite, the Space Force has to detect it and move the satellite to avoid a collision. Dropping from orbit into the digital realm, U.S. Cyber Command operatives constantly probe foreign networks, hunting for hidden zero-day vulnerabilities in adversary systems.
A preemptive cyber attack targets the civil and military infrastructure of a target state. Power grids go dark, communication towers fall silent, and weapon systems fail to boot because the underlying software has been remotely compromised. The deepest layer of this toolkit involves fighting invisible wars in space and in code, conflicts that continue even when we are officially at peace. When the stealth bombers, carrier groups, and cyber operatives synchronize, the military functions as a massive, high-precision instrument. But history shows that even the most advanced systems break down when they collide with the human element. People are unpredictable, and friction is inevitable. We face new questions regarding this rigid doctrine. What happens if an adversary successfully cripples that fragile satellite network? And how will this command structure survive the integration of artificial intelligence? As these technologies advance, we have to ask what the true impact of this 2 million person organization is on the rest of the world. And the answer to that is what we're going to cover next.
We are used to thinking about war like a simple light switch. Historically, nations were either completely at peace or tanks were rolling across borders in a state of total destruction. But today, that switch is stuck in the middle. The United States military operates almost entirely in a blurry, ambiguous space called the gray zone. In this space, adversaries claim territory and test boundaries without ever firing a bullet. It plays out through deliberate ship collisions, coordinated disinformation campaigns, and heavy-duty water cannons out in the South China Sea. To handle this, the military has to pivot. A massive, heavily armed sledgehammer is useless if the mission requires a digital surgeon. So we see branches like the Space Force quietly jamming an enemy's communication array during a critical window, rather than dropping a bomb. By staying just below the threshold of open combat, these tactics prevent the sledgehammer from ever swinging. If there are no clear front lines or formal declarations, the traditional triggers for a massive military response simply never go off. That massive sledgehammer also comes with an astronomical price tag. Developing a traditional fighter jet requires decades of engineering, complex logistics, and millions of dollars. Meanwhile, consumer technology is practically free. Anyone can buy a $500 hobby drone, strap a high-explosive mortar to the bottom, and destroy a piece of heavy armor. This completely inverts the math of combat, democratizing the tools of violence. The Pentagon's answer to skies filled with cheap, deadly swarms is the Loyal Wingman Initiative. They're actively building AI-controlled drones to fly directly alongside human pilots. There is a strict division of labor here. The computer takes over the survival mechanics, running the math to weave a jet through 1,000 incoming threats. The human retains sole authority over the moral decision to pull the trigger. The ultimate high-tax superpower can no longer react fast enough on its own. It has to outsource its very survival instincts to artificial intelligence. But relying on deep technology introduces a fatal vulnerability. The absolute nightmare scenario at the Pentagon is known as a day without space. If an adversary triggers Kessler syndrome, smashing a few key satellites to create a massive debris field, that chain reaction would tear through the entire network. The operational consequences are immediate. The clock winds back to 1942. GPS signals go dark. High-speed communications drop entirely. Precision-guided bombs turn into dead weight. The military is rapidly training troops in analog resilience. They are teaching sailors to navigate by the stars and forcing soldiers to dig out magnetic compasses. If digital networks die, the entire chain of command has to function using ink and paper. To guarantee it can operate in the future, the most advanced fighting force on the planet has to master the rudimentary skills of the past. Step away from the hardware for a second. The military is also a massive domestic institution. It is the single largest employer in the world and functions as an enormous social program. For thousands, enlistment provides a viable escape route from towns with dead economies. It offers a path to free college tuition, healthcare, and subsidized mortgages. These incentives have slowly concentrated into specific demographic pockets. We now have an isolated, generational warrior class, where a grandfather, father, and daughter will all serve in succession, while their neighbors never do. Less than 1% of the American public is actually in uniform.
To the other 99%, the military exists as a giant black box that simply absorbs money. We fund an astronomically expensive, highly lethal machine that the vast majority of the public never interacts with and fundamentally does not participate in. So why construct this massive, fragile, socially isolating machine in the first place? The entire apparatus runs on the theory of deterrence. The actual goal is not to fight wars. The goal is to make the idea of attacking the United States look so suicidal and so financially terrifying that nobody ever tries. This is the modern execution of carrying a big stick. To cast a shadow long enough to reach across the globe, you have to field 11 floating cities loaded with supersonic aircraft. Every branch serves a distinct role in that ecosystem. The Army holds the physical ground, the Air Force controls the sky, the Space Force watches the infinite, all locking together to enforce a global standstill, and that invisible perimeter directly supports your daily life. Every time you track an international shipment of fruit or follow a blue GPS dot on your phone, you are riding on the back of that exact security apparatus. The stick is heavy, and it is incredibly expensive to carry. But as long as it remains too terrifying to challenge, the gears of the modern world continue to turn, protected by a machine that works best when it never has to be used.